All right. Good morning, everyone. Well, I guess mid-morning, it's 11, so not that much of a morning for everyone. But so this is our last session of the Volunteer Development Lunch and Learn, at least the summer series. And so you can let me know in the evaluation today if you'd like to continue to do the Lunch and Learn into the fall and the spring. And I've in the last session, y'all did provide a number of topics that you wanted to explore. And so we definitely have many topics that we can explore in the fall and the spring. So I'll be happy to do it if you're looking to continue the Lunch and Learn. Just a quick recap. We've had a number of sessions. We started with engaging volunteers remotely in the first session that we did, being that we were just starting with our pandemic shutdown, and discuss ways that we can stay connected to our volunteers and continue that two-way communication. We discussed volunteer recruitment. We had some potential experts in the volunteer recruitment on that topic, and we also had a 2-hour workshop on virtual volunteer recruitment that wasn't part of the Lunch and Learn, but we did have it this summer. We also talked about capturing volunteer impact, volunteer utilization, and how we can best eliminate those barriers to allow our volunteers to serve within our organization. And now we're talking about retention, which was the rank the highest in the topics that y'all were wanting to discuss. So we do have the videos from each of those sessions, as well as the materials, the PowerPoints, and then if we had co-presenters, the materials that they provided as well. Those are available in the volunteer development newsletter that I did send out, just maybe not last week, the week before. I will share that in the chat again. So if you haven't been referring to those newsletters, I encourage you to do that. We do have a number of materials that's available in those newsletters. So today we're going to talk, when we talk about volunteer retention, it's really important to first discuss why volunteers quit anyway. We're going to explore some of the keys to retention, understanding different motivations of our volunteers, and then ways that we can properly utilize them to retain them, some potential retention strategies that we can use and employ today, and because of the situation we're in with the technology, how we can use those different technology platforms to retain our volunteers, and also maybe reduce the number of tasks that we have every day when it comes to managing our volunteers, with some tips and tricks and automation. And then we'll do our question answer wrap up and evaluation. All right, so a recent national volunteer retention study, I think there's over somewhere around 2,000 nonprofits in this study, showed that retention averages is about 66%. So what that means is about 1 in 3 of the volunteers that commits to serving potentially could be gone in a year. And that's a big issue. I mean, retention, in volunteer retention, if you look it up, if you even do just a simple Google search, it's an issue. And it's one that we often talk about, and we can't always, find the best solutions when it comes to retaining volunteers. However, we know that in the first year of a volunteer serves with us is often the most important. It's where they learn the management strategies of your organization. It's where you can onboard them and train them successfully. And so if we're not doing those things within our first year, there's less opportunity that those volunteers are going to be retained for the next year. So why do volunteers quit anyway? So we're talking about retention and how we can keep those volunteers in our organization. The first thing that we will discuss is why they're quitting. So we know why volunteers quit. They quit often. They tell us why they quit. You may have been in a volunteer role where you've quit something for whatever reason. So why do volunteers quit? So you can use your mic, or you can share in the chat. What are some reasons that volunteers are leaving and quitting? So, interest change. Oh, somebody's talking.
They run out of time. It was me. I just can't chat from my phone. I said because they run out of time to give up time?
Run out of time, exactly. They don't have the time to do it. Very good. Or the time available doesn't fit within their schedule. So thank you, Caitlin. Okay, so Victoria shared they have a change of interest. Okay. Do you want to elaborate on that, Victoria, or do you?
Yeah, I can. So sometimes it's circumstances in life, and they don't have that interest anymore, or their child is going in a different direction. Our teen gets interested in a different topic, whether it be a different club or even a different area within our club that they don't have or feel that they can continue volunteering, and maybe that's on our part or maybe it's on theirs.
Yeah, that's a good point. So change of interest, even circumstances of life or their youth or their child has a different interest. Very good. Lynette said not what they expected. Yeah, exactly. Not the role that was advertised, or eventually that role being changed into something else that originally was not what they thought it was going to be. Adriana said their kids graduate and they move on. Absolutely. Charles also said that as well. Ashley said burnout. Okay, that's a good one. So having too many things to do or being too burnt out by that role. Is that what you meant, Ashley? She might not. Okay. And then Charles said, yeah, she said absolutely. Okay, great. Charles said having a bad or difficult experience where something did not go as they wish for their child. Yeah, absolutely. So many reasons why volunteers quit. Anybody else that wants to share, why do our volunteers quit? Yeah, so Grant said, so volunteers not liking the changes we are facing in COVID's world. Yeah, so we're, and that's a good point. So not being able to utilize them in their original roles could be a reason why they're quitting. Feeling unappreciated, and absolutely, I think when it comes to any kind of volunteer role that, or not any, but volunteer roles that I've been in the past, if I've kind of overcommitted myself and unappreciated in those roles, I may look for another organization to volunteer with. So very good. A lot of great ideas to why our volunteers are quitting. So I found this just quick graphic that I wanted to share, and it was from a practitioner source on managing volunteers. And so why volunteers quit. So we're not, training them effectively. Our roles are not flexible enough. We know in this day and age, we're really busy. We have, some of us have to put our kids in school, and then we have sports, and then we have other, opportunities. Some of us might be in school and work. And so if our roles are not flexible, there's a greater opportunity that they're leaving. Maybe they're doing too much. Maybe they're doing too little. Maybe we have them in the wrong position where they don't feel that they're thriving. There's lack of communication, and we've talked about this many times, not communicating information to them, often not feeling connected. Sometimes when roles change and the volunteer doesn't get that information, or we've gone months and months without the volunteer feeling that connection with your organization. So lack of communication, an unprofessional work environment, or lack of volunteer management best practices. So some of the reasons why our volunteers might quit. And then also Victoria shared personnel changes, and they don't have a relationship with new staff. That's a very good point. And then the new staff potentially not having enough time yet to invest in those relationships. So it's another reasons why we might be using our volunteers. So we actually asked volunteers in the volunteer engagement survey, we asked them what the least enjoyable part of their role was. And so a number of things that came up. One was time management, which is something that often you also mentioned one of the reasons why volunteers are quitting. So not having that opportunity to manage their time effectively. Maybe they have too many roles. Attitudes of others, adults, or even parents. And so sometimes we can't help those attitudes of other adults. However, we can definitely help the attitudes of ourselves and our staff. And so when it comes to, potentially having that positive outlook or attitude or outlook on our programs, so that's something we can control. Lack of support, and when this was out, this was in a number of ways. What they explained lack of support being lack of support from the parish office, lack of support from community, and lack of support from other volunteers. So not having enough of the support they needed from other parents. Barriers to youth engagement, and I think this is one of the least enjoyable parts of many of our roles. So even with the situation we're in now, with some of our youth having access to internet, some of them might not. Sometimes transportation issues or various things was one of the least enjoyable part of a Louisiana 4-H volunteer's role. Paperwork was one, so just having way too much paperwork to do. Although I think we are doing a much better job of trying to reduce the amount of paperwork. We're trying to make many things electronic. So hopefully that will become a less issue in the future. Lack of communication, and that was mentioned, it's always mentioned in many of the sessions that we do. So not having that information in a timely fashion. There's also lack of funding, which I pulled out of just lack of support because it was mentioned heavily, lack of funding. And then rules or changing rules. And the context of this was not knowing when the rules change. So going out and, trying to initiate a workshop and realizing the rules are different when what they've been, in a week before, and not getting that information. And Grant made a comment here that I'm going to share. They want to know and see that we as agents are excited and invested. When they don't feel and see that, I've seen that as a negative effect. The more passionate we are, they tend to be as well. And that's a very good point, Grant. And I don't have this slide in this presentation today, but I had it in March when we had the Back to the Future conference. We had that, we talked about the engaged staff member and how that contributes to volunteer engagement. And I can share that in the recap email. So it's a really, really great point that Grant made in the chat. So thank you for sharing that. So we struggle to retain volunteers, and why do we do that? So there was some additional survey data that was produced that showed that 40% of volunteers have stopped volunteering because of poor volunteer management practices. So, and 30% of organizations that take on volunteers fail to utilize even 30% of volunteer management best practices. So if we look at our ISOCHR method that we discussed each of these calls, our identification, selection, orientation, training, utilization, recognition, and evaluation, the different components of ISOCHR, if we're using those in our programs, utilizing those effectively, and then are they helping retain our volunteers? And so if we're missing some of those critical elements of our program, potentially we might not be retaining them. And another interesting result of this study was that the time a volunteer coordinator or an individual that manages volunteers devotes to volunteer management was positively related to the organization's ability to take on and retain those volunteers. So a lot of good information when it came to volunteer management best practices and how we're using them and how they affect our retention of our volunteers. And so there's a lot of data that also shows that most organizations that take volunteers do a pretty poor job of managing them. So some national data shows that about 45% of organizations that take on volunteers do matching of roles. So if you think about, the square peg, round hole concept, that obviously if you're mismatching them in their roles, that's going to contribute negatively to your retention rates. Where about 35% are actually recognizing volunteers for their efforts. Only about 30% are actually measuring impact. About a quarter of them are providing training, and less than 20% are actually training staff to work with volunteers. So what we're going to do today, we're going to discuss some of the keys to volunteer retention. So success in our 4-H program occurs when the needs of our organization and our staff and our volunteers are met at the same time. And we might need to update our understanding of who is volunteering with our programs and why they're volunteering with our programs. We're going to discuss different motivational styles that can lead to a more effective and satisfied volunteer force. And we know that recognizing these different motivational styles can help with our retention rates as well. All right, so balancing the needs of our program, our staff, and our volunteers. So as I mentioned before, success occurs when all of the needs are met or are balanced at the same time. So I'm going to ask you a question now. What are the impacts of the following? Say that the volunteer needs are met, but the 4-H program's needs are not met. So what is the impact of that? What happens when the volunteer needs are met, but the 4-H program's needs are not? Disconnect. Absolutely, Stephanie. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Sorry, I'm a little slow in the clicking here. That seems to be the opposite of what we normally end up with. The 4-H program's needs not being met, but a volunteer's needs met. Usually it seems like they go simultaneously. Both needs are not met. This person's not happy and this program doesn't operate like it's supposed to. But I would be curious if anybody has an example of this. Not, I feel like it's, we get what we need done, but they're not always that satisfied with it.
Right. Well, and then it could start maybe to look like a burden, right? Like if we're not meeting the needs of our program, then they could be looking like just another person to take care of all the time, potentially.
Right.
Interesting. And Michael says, decline in program and youth participation. Understanding the volunteer's motivation is important. Very good. Okay, so what if the 4-H program's needs are met, but the volunteer's needs are not met? What happens then? Exactly, it's the unhappy volunteer. Exactly, yes. Volunteers are leave. Dissatisfied volunteer. They won't return. Exactly. So when our volunteers' needs are met, but the 4-H programs are not, the staff is going to see your volunteers like a burden, somebody else that we have to fix or deal with. And there might be some resistance to utilization of volunteers. But when the 4-H program's needs are met, but the volunteers' needs are not, that's when our volunteers are leaving. Or they might stay and just tell others how unhappy they are, which is also a very negative thing for a volunteer program. And they might not, okay, so Victoria said something also very important. When a volunteer won't return in this case, and they might not let us know why they are leaving. So that's good too, because we want that information. We want to know why they leave so that we can make changes. But if we don't know why, then unfortunately, that might be another issue that we have in the future. So very good. Okay, so are you, I like to use, sorry, somebody's talking. Victoria, are you there?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't think, like, if in the first scenario you gave us, if the volunteer is satisfied but the program is not, is it recognized and do we have that conversation, or is it just left unaddressed? Just like in the other scenario, like I think it's that two-way partnership that helps both sides get what they need out of their relationship.
Right. So we're trying to balance both. And so we're going to talk to you about motivational styles of volunteers. And that was actually a point that Lynette made. So when your volunteers' needs are met, like their motivational styles are met, but our program's not, then we're not going to spend a lot of time managing our volunteers. Does that make sense? Which is also problematic, right? But if we're spending the time on our program, but not meeting the needs of our volunteers, then our volunteers are leaving. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So are we trying to fit a square peg in a round hole? And so I've used this analogy often. So what happens when we try to force that peg to fit? You know, how can we avoid trying to force that square peg into a round hole? We can make sure that we're meeting the motivational needs of our volunteers and we are creating roles that they can thrive in. And so that's actually what we're going to do today. I do have a take-home activity that I can share with you in an email that you can do within your staff and your volunteer teams that can help really hit some of these ideas home. So we're going to explore a little bit of them on the call today. So understanding who volunteers and why. So we're going to talk about different motivational styles that can help increase our retention rates. And then understanding the relationship between those different motivators to help our volunteer retention, I think is critical and important. So I used this on a call previously. We talked about motivational theory. We used McLellan's and Atkins motivational theory. And so they had 3 different primary motivators for human behavior. And some of you may have used this or know this. So we have achievement, affiliation, and power that we're going to examine on the call today. So within achievement, we're focused on achieving goals and overcoming problems and how to solve those problems. In affiliation, we think about interpersonal relationships, feelings, and how they can help. And with empower and influence, we think about impact on and influence on behalf of others, leadership, and then job status and prestige. All right, so we're going to examine each of these different motivators. So within achievers, the achievers, they think about achieving their goals. They think about solving problems, strong performance, and success. And some of the strengths of the achievers is that they're well organized, they're innovative, they're good planners, they're really good problem solvers. They show strong initiative. And so you can start to think of these individuals that you might already know you have as volunteers or even as staff. Some of the struggles or the weaknesses is that they have trouble delegating. They can be impatient. Sometimes they don't value those relationships and teams enough. They're perfectionists as well. They have they're not as sensitive to the feelings and needs as others. And some of the needs they have, they need feedback because they don't like to fail. They like challenges. They like to have opportunities to grow. They have high standards. They like deadlines, responsibilities, and checklists. So if you think about the achievers, the affiliators, and those that like power, which of these do you think you fit in? Do you think you're an achiever? You want to ask me and tell me in the chat. Do we have any achievers on the call? Lynette said, that's me. Yeah, it's me also. Hannah said me. Dr. Fox said me. Victoria said, I think I'm a part achiever. Okay. So I'm going to say not everybody's going to fit perfectly into each slots. Thank you, Victoria. Charles says pretty much. So if we're lots of achievers on the call. What are the best roles for achievers? I'm going to try to do a dual screen here. Frontline. Okay. Anybody else? Prep and planning. Okay. I lost my mouse here, sorry. Organizing events. Yeah, in that role where they have multiple kind of complicated tasks. Creating guidelines that others can follow. Okay, very good. So any other roles for achievers? Dot the I's and cross the T's several times, yeah. Meticulous with those details when you got that perfectionist. That planning, helping plan, develop plans. Remember, they're problem solvers and they're very good planners. Very good. All right, so some other roles for your achievers could be the fundraising, so they get to kind of watch those fundraising dollars go up. An administrative role where they might have difficult tasks and help with planning and overall development. Training development, so getting the opportunity to pull materials together and to develop extensive training plans. Financial, so the idea to collect all that financial data and put it together in organized fashion. There's data gathering and collecting, having those professional tasks, or even being on that board of directors. So many roles for your achievers. And Stephanie says her achievers have been helping her navigate the COVID stuff. Do you want to talk about that, Stephanie?
Yeah, I can. I can give you a specific. One of my shooting sports instructors, Robert Bro, has been kind of helping us go through, like, okay, how are we going to do this step to this step to this step on, bringing kids in, moving them to where they need to be, keeping them where they need to be, and then moving them out of the facility, just so that we can, have our normal-ish shooting sports practices. And so he's one of those that I don't have to second guess. I don't have to question. I don't have to go back and ask more information for. It's all laid out. It's very simple. It's not, overly wordy or complicated, but we're going to do this, 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 and this. I like that. So that's what I say. He's been helping with the navigation of that. So.
And in a situation like of a crisis, he's thriving in his role. That's very good. Thank you for sharing. All right, so we're going to talk next about the affiliators. So these are the individuals that think about those interpersonal relationships. They often have that, think about the feelings of their feelings and the feelings of others, and they're looking for how they can help. They're really good team players, and they're good listeners and persuaders. So you're starting to think, oh, these are the individuals that I should have in an ambassador or recruitment role. You're right. Some of the struggles or weaknesses with our affiliators is they can be oversensitive. They sometimes struggle with dealing with conflict. They sometimes throw time out the window. They need affirmation. They can overreact, and they don't like to be alone. So some of the needs are they need to be helped and be needed. They like to be included. They like to be supervised by a leader that's more of a friend. They need that personal recognition, and they do need opportunities to express their feelings. So do we have these, and these people are often your connectors too, and so that they can be very effective in those roles where you need those connections with others. Is there anybody on the call today that feels like they're an affiliator? I'm a little both. Yeah, and I think it's a good point. So sometimes your motivational needs change with time as some of your other needs are met. And affiliation is a high second for Dr. Fox, and thank you for sharing that. And so I want to say, like, affiliation never used to be, you know, a motivational factor for me, but it has become definitely important for me over time. And so others may feel the same way. So what are some of the best roles for your affiliators? Does anybody want to share? Whoops, I want to do that. Being a mentor to new volunteers, that's good. Small group leaders, volunteer manager. Yes, very good, Lynette. Yeah, the person who checks people into events and goes around and sees how everybody's doing. Absolutely. Other roles that you could put your affiliators into. It seems simple, but a greeter, absolutely. And I'll say your achievers, some of your others can be a greeter too, but if you're trying to, you know, match the volunteer with the perfect role, I do think your affiliator would be suited for that. They are good in a team, and they are very effective in that team environment. And good team players. All right. Esther said, affiliators are good advisory members. Dr. Fox says social or recognition events. Very good. So maybe your affiliators can help with some of these activities. So best roles for affiliators, so that maybe directing your client services and maybe having that public relations role, any of those support type activities, planning and giving recognition to others. And Dr. Fox just mentioned that, potentially leading support groups, being in that ambassador role, connector role, and obviously managing. Lynette said volunteer manager is very good too. And then mentoring, coaching others, and various roles that your affiliators can be in. So very good. Or the next one we're going to discuss, we're going to talk about those individuals are motivated by power and influence. So they think about their impact, the influence on behalf of others. What's in it for me? Keeping that personal power that I have. Often think about leadership, prestige, and job status. Some of the strengths of them, they open doors. They're the strategic thinkers. They can be good teachers and trainers, in that fundraising role as well. And they're able to work through those different organizational hierarchies. Some of the struggles is that they can be dominating, possibly intimidating to an individual like an affiliator. They can be argumentative and outspoken. They need those positions of leadership and influence. They need that recognition. They need prestige, and they need job status. So do we have any individuals on this call that would identify with the power and influence? Is there anybody that have seen that this reminds them of some of their volunteers? Stephanie says, not me. I love to work behind the curtains. You know, I've seen a lot of this type of individual in athletics, I think, you know, really motivated by that overarching leadership role and job status. Also within the world of fundraising, I think some foundation board members, okay, Dr. Fox mentioned that also. Livestock volunteers, interesting. So what are the best roles for these? One of my foundation board members, definitely. It's interesting that y'all are saying that in that position of fundraising and then also on boards. What are the best roles for these people? Some of the roles that you could put these individuals in.
I feel like they might need some training and kind of guidance to stay within the boundaries needed. But if it's a hard conversation and there's an ask that needs to be made, these people would thrive in that. Like if it needs to be a spoken, like a city council meeting to share, like if you're going through budgets or something, that kind of what comes to mind for these people.
Yeah. Really great thoughts. Actually, there's a lot of great thoughts y'all are sharing right now. Like Victoria said, this is not me, but helpful to have on a team. Stephanie said, I have volunteers that fit this as well. And Rochelle said, this is a leader role, put them in charge of something. Calling past fundraiser contacts that have stopped fundraising. Ooh, that's a really, really strategic placement. Very good. Ashley said, raising money, speaking and promoting the program to key leaders. Absolutely. So Dr. Fox said something very interesting. I don't know if you want to share openly, Dr. Fox, if you have an opportunity to do so or not.
Yes, I think, you know, something has come out, I guess, with the different types of power. And so if somebody's in it for personal power, I think that's the people we often think of as the people that are so power hungry that might create some issues. But there are some people that are very power driven related to a cause. And so if you can find those power people that are related to a cause and believe in 4-H or believe in your cause, maybe like some of the livestock people, they're great at connecting with some high-powered individuals, opening doors, whether it's to strategically position the program or whether it's to raise funds or create an awareness. So there are, and I mean, I can think of one person that all of us probably know who I would say is a power-oriented person, but she's very much powered towards a cause. And so she's, but yeah, passionate about their programs or projects.
Yeah, that's very good. Great deal. All right, so good conversations here. So some of the roles that you could put these individuals into. So we talked about advocacy, policy making, even that fundraising role, political action, having them as your speaker or trainer. We discussed that too. Media representative. So, you know, I always loved having those individuals that could talk to media when I, you know, really didn't feel like talking to media. They're very, very helpful to have. In that leadership role, board chair or chair of a powerful committee or task force. So many different roles that we explored for your power and influence people. So I'm going to say, if you would like to do this activity within your volunteer teams, I'm going to send you just a take-home activity that you can follow, where you can divide into teams and discuss their need. So within those teams, after they do the survey, discuss the needs and the favorite roles that they've been into, and things like their preferred work atmosphere and preferred supervisor. And then hopefully what you'll come to find is that those recognizing that the needs of your different volunteers and that conflict obviously can arise between those different individuals and because of their motivational styles. And then learning to adapt to those different styles is pretty important when it comes to managing volunteers. And then over time, hopefully you'll be able to retain them once you recognize their different motivational needs. And so I'll send that activity and some additional materials out that you can do within your programs. And recognizing that motivational needs change as well as we meet them. We might have other needs. So this activity, like a number of us have discussed in the chat, we didn't fit particularly in one single area, and that over time our needs have definitely changed. All right, so we're going to move on now. We have about 20 minutes left. And just give me 1 second. I got a little static, and I don't know if it's my computer or somebody else's. Okay, great. All right. So we're going to talk about a couple things, some takeaways. So proper utilization of volunteers to increase retention. We're going to discuss some retention strategies that you can employ today, and then using our technology to increase our retention as well. So this was a slide we actually discussed in a previous Lunch and Learn. So obviously we talked about that two-way communication, keeping that two-way communication open, finding a way to connect with your volunteers ongoing, so telephone, email, video chat, making sure that when things change in your program that we're communicating that information to our volunteer leaders as often as we possibly can. And one thing, and I know I'm not going to say who it is on the call, they're on the call today, but I'm not going to put them on the spot, but in trying to recruit for camp last year, this individual showed me that anytime any information was done internally, that they often looped their volunteer in so that they had a chain of updated camp information. So as soon as it was made final within their office, their volunteer often got that information almost immediately. So it allowed them, it avoided that situation where a volunteer might be at an event and hear about a policy or situation change or some other information that they may not have had before. And so that can be embarrassing and uncomfortable. And so that's one way that individual looped those volunteers in every single important decision that was made when it came to camp. Also, when it comes to removing barriers, so we're listening to what our volunteers need. We have that relationship with them that's two-way. And we're often looking for additional training or resources that they need to perform their role effectively. We're developing a structure that allows them to perform. So if we're using volunteer teams, especially when the situation we're in with the pandemic, how are we organizing those teams? So are we using, our free service like Google Docs or Google Forms or Google Files, or Microsoft Teams? Microsoft Teams has various tools to help us manage our volunteer teams. If you've been using that team that we created to share volunteer development resources, you'll see one time I demoed how volunteer teams could be used. So how are we developing a structure for our volunteers to effectively lead? And then when we're providing feedback, we're making sure that feedback is two-way. We're offering our volunteers to provide feedback on our organization, and then we're giving them feedback on their leadership role. So some different retention strategies that you can deploy today. So obviously we talk about keeping track of volunteer data. There's information that tells us that about only half of us are doing a good job in doing that. So if we're tracking all of our volunteer information, if we're updating our contact info and our enrollment numbers, We can encourage our volunteers to log their impact for annual awards. In partnership with the VLA, we do have an impact form. And so if that information is in the newsletter, and you can share the how-to guide with them as well. That information could be vital to you in learning how the volunteer is contributing and also what potential needs and resources they need. And then equipping our volunteers with training. We have professional development and we have training opportunities available online right now. But are you offering them ongoing training and support, and what does that look like? Obviously, recognition is a part of retention. So if we are, having these ongoing volunteers of the month or acknowledging our different volunteer milestones, we're sending thank you cards, birthday greetings, so opportunities for us to show our volunteers that we care. And then we're making good impressions. So we talked about volunteer management best practices and how are we using those? Are we employing those? And so if we're doing on the onset, we're enrolling them, we're orienting them, training them, we're providing, those touch points along the way, two-way communication, we're going to have a better opportunity to retain those volunteers long term. Right, when it comes to technology, so we're in that situation where we're still sort of at home, we're, working in small groups. You can automate some of your efforts, and I put just a star on some because I don't love, when it talks about automation and volunteer management. But in saying that, you can schedule out, volunteer newsletters, you can schedule out social media posts, you can do delayed deliveries on your emails so that you can set a lot of these touch points up, but then you can go, home at the end of the day and they can go out ongoing, where you don't have to monitor them and track them, and you can spend your time doing other things. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't used those social media posting tools or delayed deliveries on email or scheduling newsletters, that's one way you can free up your time for other things and not worry about it, move on. Keeping in touch, we know we've got technology tools like Teams, e-newsletters, we've got email. We talked about GroupMe on another call, text messages. So various ways you can still stay connected using your technology. Creating remote or virtual positions. So discussing, so we talked about how some of our volunteers have issues when it comes to time. And so are we creating these virtual positions that they can still impact our organization and serve when their time is a little bit less, they have less time available? And then are we putting in these systems for feedback? And we can use a lot of technology tools to do that. Digital surveys, social media, direct emails as well. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of a feedback. So what did you take away from today's session? You want to share, open your mic. Or share in the chat. And I actually had one more slide that I guess I failed to put in the show today, but it was kind of something that I wanted to ask you all about. So while you're doing that, I'm going to see if I can pull it up. So any takeaways, anybody? Okay. Okay, Victoria said the types of volunteer motivations and what roles they align to. Caitlin said better ways to align volunteers with appropriate roles. Yeah, Dr. Fox's comments about types of power, I think that's really, really interesting. And I think something we could dive into in the future. Stephanie said, need to remember motivation when we're utilizing and where best to utilize them. Adriana said, I need to remember to schedule sending emails to be more time effective. And Charles said, the more you communicate our plans with our volunteers, the better you can support the youth in the many roles they serve. Absolutely, it's very good. And they're going to feel more connected and more involved. And valued, yes. So that's a really good point, and I wanted to share just an idea. I have just a question, and I wanted to ask it for all of y'all today. Just something that I've thought about, and I wanted to ask it. So, so one thing that I've noticed is that we treat our volunteers and more like employees and less like donors. And I thought that was very interesting. And so it's kind of a food for thought. Tell me what you're thinking. So I have here a very large number on the screen, right? That's our Louisiana 4-H, the volunteer hours based on our volunteer engagement survey. So total economic impact based on the value of a volunteer time. And it's interesting because we take that number every year and we assign it to a dollar value to the services that our volunteers are providing our organization. But do we treat them like we treat our donors? So that's a question. Do we treat volunteers and donors differently? And obviously we have to because of the different roles they have. But are our volunteers more like donors because they're providing a service to our organization, or are they more like employees? So that's a question. If anybody wants to share their thoughts. And the reason I'm asking is I thought it was kind of interesting that there's a lot of literature that talks about donating time to donor relationships and how important it is to an organization that takes on like a nonprofit. But do we treat our employees, our volunteers like donors, or do we treat them like volunteers? And that's a question. Does anybody have any thoughts? Yeah, I just thought it was an interesting thought, and I wanted to share it because we're talking about retention. So thank you, Victoria. And I just don't, I mean, obviously they're different. They serve different roles. But yeah, and Stephanie, that's a good thought, like building relationships. And Adriana said, seems like a mixed concept. Very good. Adriana, do you want to comment what you mean by that? Many of them serve both roles. This has been a struggle. So Charles made a good point. What he just said is, so volunteers sometimes are our donors as well. And so just massaging those relationships is very, very important. And that's really what I was trying to get at with this slide too, is that the relationship piece is really vital. So when we're thinking about, working with our donors or working with our volunteers, remember that relationship and making sure that you spend time massaging it. All right, so thank you for exploring with me. I'm going to go back. All right, just remember that we still have the volunteer development resource sharing team. If you're in need of it, you can still join. That's the code on your screen. I'll share that in the email as well. So I'll share many things to that, and some of the resources from these calls also. All right, and so I'm going to send out some additional resources after this call, and then there's an evaluation, obviously, that I'll share, and I'm going to share that directly in the team today, because the last time I shared it, y'all had some difficulty getting it. I think that's the link. And then Stephanie said creating a relationship takes time. And with less of us, we run out of time to devote to the needed relationship. That's a really good point. So remembering that those other factors that contribute to retention are things like having less staff to dedicate to retaining volunteers. And some of us, might lack that office space or other resources we really need right now. That definitely contributes to whether we can retain our volunteers or not. All right. So I just shared that evaluation in the chat. So Adriana said her mic does not work, but I was trying to say that sometimes I see my volunteers as peers and others as donors of their time and resources. Very good. Thank you, Adriana. All right, well, that's all I have for today. Thank y'all so much. Please complete the evaluation, and if you want to do lunch and learn in the fall and the spring, just let me know. We have a number of topics that we still need to explore.